All right, you're good. It's going, right? Good. In case it falls, fall on that.
Okay, are we ready?
It's a new one.
Okay.
Let's be careful.
Next speaker will be William King, who will be speaking about the physiological emotion measurement of user experience.
Okay, so we're considering the UX field. What could we learn if we were able to look inside users' heads while they were using the product? So in this talk, I'm going to argue that physiological measures provide a commercially viable and objective way to measure emotion in user experience research. And so emotion plays a very large role in user experience. So for instance, you could have a very frustrating experience with a poorly designed website and want nothing to do with it and want to never go back to it again. Or you could have a really pleasant experience and you know, want to tell your friends about it. So when considering emotion, it's useful to consider emotion in terms of three facets. Firstly, emotion has a valence component, and that basically refers to whether or not the emotion is positive or negative. Secondly, you have arousal, which measures is a measure of the overall intensity of the emotion. So you could have, you know, this would be the distinction between, you know, a pleasant experience and an ecstatic experience. And then lastly, there's the component of context, and this is basically whatever it is in the world out there that is causing the emotion. So subjective evaluations are inadequate to measure emotion, and the reason being that there are problems with being able to people's abilities to adequately monitor their own internal states. However, new techniques are arising, such as EEG, galvanic skin response, and eye tracking, and these can provide a lot more objective measures. So in this talk, I'm going to discuss each of these methods and how they can be used. So first off, we have electroencephalography, or EEG, and basically you measure experience. You measure the physiological. You measure electrical activity in the brain. So how does EEG work? Basically, neurons activate using electricity, and this electricity travels from the brain to the scalps because all of the tissue in between is connected. And this, the electricity at the scalp is measured with sensors, and gives you an idea about the activity that's going on in the brain. So there are commercially viable options for EEG now that are more suited for UX research than lab-based systems. For instance, we have the Emotiv headset here, and these are relatively cheap when compared to other measures such as MRI, and this headset is easy to set up, and it's less messier because it doesn't involve any gels, and research has shown that these commercially available EEGs are just as accurate as lab-based EEGs. So EEG can tell us about the valence, and the way it does this is through the measuring the frontal asymmetry. So basically, when you have a positive experience, you have more activation in the left frontal hemisphere, and when you have a negative experience, you have more activation in the right frontal hemisphere. So after the data has been filtered and transformed, it's relatively easy to interpret the data. So here we have the red line referencing positive emotions and the blue line referencing the negative emotions. So for an example of how EEG can be used in UX research context, researchers assessed emotional reactions to people performing tasks on a media player. And they found that they were able to identify specific UI features that caused a negative emotional reaction. And they also found that overall the more current version of the media player produced more positive emotions than negative. So the second tool that we have to measure physiological states is the galvanometer. And this measure galvanic skin response based on emotional stimuli. So how the galvanometer works by passing a weak electrical current between two electrodes, and the emotional stimuli engages the central nervous system, which causes sweat glands to produce moisture, and then when the electrical current meets the moisture, it creates an electrical resistance. So there are many pros to the galvanometer. It's cheap, it's non-invasive, and it's highly temporally accurate, and it's widely available. So here we have one commercially available galvanometer, which is Shimmer. It's basically just a wireless wristband, and it projects the data out to the computer via Bluetooth. And unlike lab-based galvanometers, it doesn't require any gels. So galvanic skin response is relatively easy to interpret. Basically, it's peaks of spikes that are basically measuring physiological. So, like I said, GSR can tell you about arousal. So higher spikes indicate higher levels of arousal. And when you combine this with the EEG data, you get a more fuller picture of the emotional experience. So for an example of how GSR can be used to, in a UX research context, researchers found that they could discriminate between ill-designed and well-designed websites. And they found that the poorly designed website produced higher arousals than a well-designed website. Thirdly, there's the you have eye tracking, and eye trackers just tell you essentially where people are looking at a given point in time. And the way it works is the eye tracker bounces infrared light into the user's eyes and creates a fixed glare on the surface of the eye called a corneal reflection. And then the eye tracker then maps the direction of the gaze by triangulating the fixed glare with the pupil. So for a commercially available eye tracker, you have the Tobii X230. It's really easy to set up. It's just a You just simply plug it into the USB, and it's relatively cheap compared to earlier versions of eye trackers. And it's lightweight and unobtrusive. So when you're interpreting eye tracking data, it's useful to use gaze plots. Gaze plots are essentially a map of the order and the duration of the time that people look at specific points. Eye tracking tells you about the emotional context, so basically it tells you what people are interested in. So when you combine this, the valence and the arousal with the eye tracking data, it allows you to see what people are feeling when they look at a particular point. And so in conclusion, physiological measures allow us to look inside the mind of the user, and so EEG provides information about valence, GSR provides information about arousal, and eye tracking provides information about context.
How much is the Tobii eye tracker? Do you know? That one?
I think it's about 2,000.
Still a lot cheaper than the traditional lab ones, I guess, right? Which are like 30.
Oh, yeah, they're 20 to 30.
But Dan Roberts sent out that email, the HVAC list recently. There's that $100 one that's coming out. It's
Oh.
supposed to be soon. As long as you're doing just basic usability research, it should be perfectly fine for that. But
Yeah. I mean, you only need 30 frames per second.
yeah, I think it has like 60 or something.
Do they ever use this to gauge movie experience,
I
for
can't hear
example?
you.
Do they ever use these technologies to gauge movie experience? For example, you know.
Oh, did you stop it?
Yeah.